Last week we launched the KPMG Agribusiness Agenda. Had 13 topics in it, which we talked about in relation to today's potential, tomorrow's possibilities. When you break each of those topics down, fundamentally, at the core, realizing any of them requires collaboration. We've been writing about collaboration for years. In fact, I can trace my whakapapa in writing about collaboration in New Zealand's agri-sector back to 2012, when we wrote quite a big piece about the opportunity inherent in industry good. We had the opportunity, and through discussions with AgMart, to actually spend a bit more time exploring what industry good might look like in the future. What we'd like to do this morning is give you a soft launch of a report we will be issuing next year, probably not that long, but in the next month or so. We've talked to a lot of people. We've explored where industry good's working for New Zealand and where it's not, and we've thought about what industry good might look like in the future. Before I ask Brig to talk about some of the conversations we've had and some of the findings that have come out of those conversations, industry good we've defined very widely, not just the levy bodies. We've defined it as activities done by any organisation which benefits the sector as a whole. So as a consequence, it's membership bodies, it's levy bodies, it's activities being done in cooperatives, it's activities being done in the CRIs and in the universities. So we've taken a very wide lens to industry good to think about where it's working and where it could be delivering more for New Zealand. So Brig, maybe if you talk about what we've heard, then I'll introduce where we've got to.
Thanks, Ian. I'll just flash our classic KPMG disclaimer up and jump into it. So what I'm going to talk to is, as Ian said, what we've heard, the findings of those conversations, and we really tried to go wide and deep in terms of who we spoke to, and very much cross-sector in terms of that. I'm going to cover the strengths, the challenges that we've identified, some of the key constraints, and then sort of set up the principles for what could an alternative look like, and then Ian will launch into where we landed. So I've only got 7.5 minutes to condense what has typically taken us about an hour to get through, so we'll crack on. So in terms of the strengths, one of the key strengths that we consistently heard is our collectivist culture, which means that we've got this willingness to pool resources for a collective good, and that's particularly been done by producers throughout our sector's history. But of the industry good organisations that we could access financial reports for, we identified about $183 million, which is going through those organisations, channelled into these good activities. It's probably a bit small on the screen there, but this is just one of the diagrams from the report covering the wide range and breadth of different activities that do good within the sector and are done by these industry good organisations. So we want to acknowledge that it came through very strongly. There is a lot of inherent good in the activities that these organisations are doing for the sector. And I think probably a shout out, if we recognise just how important our food and fibre sector is to our economy, there's an argument to be had that the economy of Aotearoa is pretty dependent on the critical activities that we've outlined in that diagram. So moving on to what were the key challenges. So this is what we heard from the people we spoke to. Consistently we heard that there's duplication of effort and resource. Because of the way in which we've structured our industry good organisations, particularly in the way in which they're funded, demonstrating that you're delivering value to those who are funding you is widespread. At times it's inefficient. When I talked about that 183 million, we were able to identify about 5%, which is actually in just administrative services, leasing premises, that sort of thing. That's replicated across all of those. And that was just from 40 of the organisations that have to publicly put their annual reports out. So we're pretty conservative on that one. It's at times inefficient, and it also drives some poor behaviour, this demonstration of value. Secondly, value for many in our sector, particularly over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, has been equated with lobbying for defence of the status quo and championing your respective industry to our regulators. As a result, many of our industry good organisations have shifted. They've had a change in their role to focus more on advocacy. Another key thing that we heard is that the processes and structures for governance are largely through election. They're based on representation. And what that's meant is, firstly, it's putting those leaders who are put into those governance positions in a particularly challenging position to actually operate best practice governance. But we also heard that there's concern that those leaders those boards don't necessarily have the right skills mix that we need for the sector moving forward. And then finally, it came through time and time again that there are too many industry good organisations. I think we stopped counting eventually after we hit about 150, because every week we'd find another one that is actually delivering industry good to the sector. But what we also uncovered in this investigation is, despite all we heard about demonstrating that you're delivering value, there's a significant cohort of our food and fibre sector and that are not being recognised. They're not feeling that they are being served. And I'll just give you the stats. So they've got 23 billion in food and fibre assets. They've got 50% of the fishing quota, 40% of forestry, 30% of sheep and beef production comes from them, 10% of dairy, and 10% of Kiwi exports. And what we heard when we talked to our Māori interviewees is that they don't feel that their unique challenges or ownership structures are being recognised, and those organisations that are meant to be delivering value to them aren't. So they've created their own organisations specific for them. So when we distilled down everything that we'd heard, all the conversations we'd had, everything that we had read, we came up with these 4 key constraints which we believe are holding us back from our potential. Firstly, there's a lack of trust at all levels within the sector and industry good ecosystem, which has essentially eroded belief and confidence. There's a lack of trust between the people who are funding the organisations, that they're working in their best interests. There's a lack of trust between different industry good organisations, that anybody else could possibly still work in their own industry's best interests, or that they could possibly do a better job than them. Secondly, the immediate needs, the immediate wants of today. Sorry, I'm originally South African, I've been told I say want, a bit weird, but the immediate wants of today are being prioritised when it comes to decision making and investment. What we really need is we need investment that's long-term, intergenerational, but the existing frameworks with which these industry good organisations operate revolve around a 1 to 6 year cycle. So that's a constraint. Thirdly, everything in industry good largely revolves around your land use type. As a result, what we've seen and experienced is territorialism, patch protection, and it's creating barriers to actually working together. I was up here yesterday talking about working together, so you can sort of see the segue. But it's ingrained this siloed approach to addressing common issues. And then finally, we're an export sector. The food and fibre is an export sector, but currently industry good orientates itself primarily just to within the farm gate. We think that we need to be actually orientating ourselves towards our markets and our consumers. So where did all of this sort of lead us to? We came up with sort of 6 design principles that we feel are necessary for any sort of reimagining, any sort of alternative system. And they're largely based, you'll see almost some of the direct opposites from the previous slide, they're largely based on that. But essentially, we're looking for decision-making that is focused on the future and is long-term rather than now. We think that there needs to be an environment where organisations can put aside differences for the good of the whole sector, where those organisations are prioritising their decisions based on responses to what's happening in the market signals. Most of the existing industry good organisations, the existing work and who's funding it are producers. It's at that producer level, when actually there are many others who are benefiting across the value chain and within our sector. So we believe that we would want to see better integration across that whole value chain. 5th one, so investment that can go beyond the land use silos and delivers benefit to multiple stakeholders. And then finally, we heard this a lot in the conversations, but clear roles and responsibilities to help avoid some of that unnecessary duplication. So I'll hand over to Ian to talk about where we sort of landed based on that.
So, to think about the future, you need to create a future. So what we did first in terms of this journey is we envisaged what the future will look like in 10 to 15 years' time. We envisaged a future where most farmers are farming more than one thing. The reality is there will not be dairy farmers or red meat farmers or kiwi fruit growers, because people will need to have multiple streams in their businesses to enable them to have resilience. At the same time, they will also be paid for delivering ecosystem services to society. There will be monetization mechanisms for biodiversity in water and soil, as well as climate. On top of that, most farmers will be connected in to a circular bioeconomy product or solution, potentially more than one. And one of the things that we staunchly believe is that every food company will be an energy company. I know you heard from Mike Casey yesterday. We believe that is an inherent part of the future for this sector. So if you create that sort of future where we're working very collaboratively and working across multiple different streams, it starts to create a future which we have called common ground. Common ground is a concept that's about how do we use cooperation models, how do we work together in areas where cooperation makes sense, how do we still compete when that makes complete sense. There are areas that when you look across the system as it stands today, multiple organisations, in fact in some cases maybe more than 30 or 40 organisations are working on exactly the same issue, all spending small amounts and committing small amounts of resource to those issues. If we can find a platform to enable that resource to be shared, the opportunity to not have people do the same thing over and over again, but scale it so you have impact at a much greater level is significant. So if you look at the common ground model, and when we issue the report, you'll see a much more complex model. This is our simplification to try and get it onto one slide and make it readable. Basically, the idea is that common ground is a new entity, but it is a platform entity, one that's led by a governance body. And I would stress that governance body is not representative. That governance body is selected for the people that have the skills to be able to identify and connect with the true issues that will help us take a step forward in terms of delivering value to the sector and to New Zealand. Common Ground has a group of people, we've referred to them as activators and facilitators. They are people that can assess what issues are best handled collaboratively and then work to create the collaborative groups, which we've described as communities of action, to take that issue forward and create transformational outcomes. Another key part of what we've thought about in terms of Common Ground is that ability to address duplication. Brig mentioned the amount of money being spent across the levy bodies, we can see the numbers for just doing the accounts and tax and HR and legal and all those things that are back office services. The engine room is proposed as a way to enable organisations, should they choose, to have that work done for them and done at a lower cost. Anybody can join Common Ground. This is not a model that's exclusive to purely the industry good bodies. We welcome farmers and producers to think about how they could step into it. We welcome wider sector participants right the way through to retailers selling our products in international markets. We know from some of the work we've been doing in other areas, they're incredibly keen to co-invest with New Zealand farmers. We also, this is not a big bang. This doesn't fundamentally change the Commodity Levy Act. It doesn't change the industry good organisations. What it requires them to do is think differently about how they do business. It's about culture change rather than structural change. It's about thinking about where we can get more value because we partner with others. If you think about it, we have a ceiling on trust in New Zealand at the moment. We've had a ceiling where areas where we've been able to work incredibly well together. Response to adverse events, you just look at how we responded to the cyclone. It was fantastic in terms of how the organisation went. But in terms of as things get more difficult or things are less obvious, our ability to progress has definitely been constrained. We've sort of drawn our top of our ceiling at about the M-Bovis level. We think water quality sitting at or around the top of it. I think we saw with Hei Waka Eka Noa, for the industry, that was a step too far. The trust didn't exist for us to get that far at this point in time. How would we suggest that works? Common ground is about finding those things, whether it's shared agendas and shared opportunities to do things together. We're not suggesting it steps into water, climate or biodiversity as its first step. You can see there are areas we are already more comfortable collaborating in, things like biosecurity. So what we would see is an evolution of common ground over a period of time, rather than it just appearing at a particular point in time. And that's because as trust builds, the confidence to step into something more will be there. So what we are looking at, and what our view is, the sector needs a body that makes it easy to collaborate on the things we should collaborate on, where the right resource and expertise can be deployed to that opportunity, where the government can have a true partner to invest alongside. And as a consequence, we do things faster, we do things better, and we do things with impact that creates a better return for those that ultimately are still funding it, being levy payers, members, organisations, processors that are putting investment in, but also creates better outcomes for New Zealand more quickly. That's a very brief overview. What we've got on the QR code here is an online survey. Please feel free to click on that. Having heard a brief overview from Brig and myself, we would really like your first impressions of the common ground concept. We still have more work to do. We want to refine how we present it. So if there's questions you have, please put them into the survey. Your initial reactions are really helpful for us so that we can then work over the next few weeks to put together the final proposal that we'll bring out. What I also want to stress is we are not suggesting we have the 100% correct solution. In fact, we're not suggesting we've got a 10% correct solution. What we've got is a solution to start a conversation. And we really do value your feedback to help us make sure that conversation goes as far and as quickly as it could do. What we're now going to do, though, is invite some friends onto the stage in terms of Brendan and Phil. And we're going to have a bit of a chat. Phil's been involved in helping us develop it as a director of AgMart. Brendan's actually listened to the introduction twice already, so he's now heard it 3 times, so hopefully he's got it. And
it's going to be a test.
Yeah. And we're really keen to take your initial questions as well. So to confuse things, if you've got questions to ask to the panel, please put those into the app. Please fill in the questionnaire to help us with our work as well. But I'll hand back to Brig now because she's got all the things under control.
Thanks, Ian. And maybe just a little plug, what's in it for you? If you go to the QR code, you can pop your email address to make sure that when we do release this, it'll land in your inbox for you. So sweeten the pot a little bit, so to speak. But yeah, please, I've got my phone here, so we'll take questions as well. So if you've got immediate questions that you'd like answered, please fire them through, and I'll try to manage all of this. But Brendan and Phil, thank you both for being here, for sitting with us. What were your initial reactions or thoughts to the work and what you've heard about Common Ground concept? I appreciate for the audience, this is the first time, but both of you have had a little bit of prep behind it. So, yeah, maybe Brendan, we'll start with you.
Well, I know that Agmart and yourselves started out with the intent of being provocative, and I think sort of tick the box. I think that's well achieved, and therefore it's a very useful dynamic to introduce into the sector in terms of provoking some discussion and exploration. I think there's some unassailable truths that are in the report. It's very easy to identify those truths when you're looking at others, so I nod vigorously when I think of others there, and maybe not as vigorously when I think of ourselves, but I'm sure there's lessons for us to learn, even though we're a younger organisation. And so, yeah, I think a very positive dynamic to start digging into and figuring out what those truths are and what a better outcome would be to sort of addressing those truths in maybe different ways than the sector is doing that now. I think the language of common ground is really important. That I guess when you're doing collaborative practice is all about identifying common ground and then maybe identifying the things that you can agree on, and looking at working on those, even if there are bigger issues that you can't agree on. But you build your collaborative fitness by working on those things that you agree on, so that there's some of those other things maybe become a little bit more easy to address later on. So I think the report does a good job of setting the ground for that. The only thing I'd say is there needs to be space left for the industry groups and the organisations to identify what that common ground really is. So I know you're talking about a platform and you're using the term common ground. I changed the term myself. I think common ground is actually something quite sacred, and the process of identification of what actually is common ground is important. And that's what maybe the platform could enable.
I suppose from my perspective as a farmer or grower or producer or land manager, a lot of what's in it resonated in terms of the fragmentation and the number of groups that are involved in doing sort of industry good work. And so I guess that resonated. And then in terms of some of the other stuff that's been presented, I guess the other one that for me strongly resonated was that concept of the trust diagram. And so in some respects, in order for us to collaborate well or to find common ground, we need to be doing some of the easier things at an organisational or a combined level first, before we take on sort of some of the big deep-seated challenges, I guess, for our sector. And I suppose what would be nice and what I quite like about the concept is that some of that work together can happen at an organisational level, and it probably removes some of the reliance on relationships, I think. And I think for the most part the sector's done a great job in improving its collaborative intent, but I guess a lot of that is then relying upon how individuals and individual relationships and given the overriding sort of politic of a lot of this stuff, then that can change relatively quickly and sometimes not based on strict logic. Yeah.
I think that's a really good call out actually, Phil, because one thing that did come through is the intent and the willingness to work together is there. It's just that we haven't quite figured out how to do that. So, Brendan, this is a question for you. As the Chief Executive of an industry good organisation, I don't know if we actually bio-profiled Brendan, but if you don't know, he's the Chief Executive of AgriTechNZ, so he's one of the industry good organisation leaders. So as the Chief Executive of an industry good organisation, can you see your organisation being a part of a common ground or something like it?
Yeah, I'd like to think it's actually in our DNA already. So we're an independent member organisation that looks at connecting and promoting and advancing the interests around agri-tech in and from New Zealand, and so we're sort of already proud of the ecosystem representation that we've got. We're member funded, so it's it's probably inappropriate to say that I would murder for levy funding, but I'd definitely hold somebody hostage for levy funding if I thought I'd get away with it. And so some of what you identify in the report around the constant need to be justifying ourselves to members, I mean, that's a healthy dynamic actually. It's appropriate. But in our ecosystem representation, as well as obviously having the agri-tech innovators out there with the established businesses or the newer businesses, the levy groups are already engaging in our ecosystem. So, Hort NZ and Dairy NZ and Beef and Lamb NZ are already seeing that when it comes to the role of innovation and technology in the sector, that an organisation like ours is something that they want to engage in. So I guess we do get our sort of snip of levies because they've joined as members through that process. And so absolutely, we would commit time and resources to the projects or the problems that might get identified through such a platform, and definitely look at corralling the range of interests that we've got. We see it as pretty much the only way to achieve both what we need to achieve for our community, but also for our contribution to new and better outcomes for New Zealand.
Thanks, Brendan. Phil, you've been looking at this topic for a while. 2020 Nuffield Scholar, your report was entitled Restructuring Industry Good for the Future.
Yep.
So has your thinking shifted since your Nuffield, and how does it compare with where we've landed with Common Ground?
Yes, I suppose in terms of a bit of a backstory, I started, I did a Nuffield in 2020 and was looking at, I was in a position where we'd started farming and quickly identified that I was a land manager and wanted to basically improve our economic returns and also maximise our ecosystem services. And so I wanted to find out how the heck can I go about doing that, where can I find information? And I guess what I identified through that was it was a little bit hard to do that, and that I resonated with a range of different organisational groups that were sort of acting in the industry good space. So I sort of thought, well, okay, this is fertile ground for a Nuffield scholarship. And I focused on the levy bodies, specifically the Commodity Levies Act, and I guess what Ian and Brig have reaffirmed is that the Commodity Levies Act does a heap of stuff that's really good, right? And when you benchmark it globally, it does a whole bunch of things really well. It's democratic, it allows flexibility, it's an efficient way to collect funds because it does it on the basis of what is produced. But I suppose in my little bent, I went down sort of a structures and systems approach, because I at that time heard that, and I reflect a little bit, that I heard at the time that if we only collaborate better and we only talk to each other and we only tell our story, then all of our industry issues will go away. And I sort of thought, that's bullshit. Like we need to do a little bit more than this. And so I sort of started to look at, well, what might be restricting us from doing that? And I went down the systems and structures approach. And so my sort of hypothesis a little bit was that, we need a great culture to have high performance, but ultimately a culture or stuff is set up and maximised by the way that we arrange ourselves and the systems that we operate in. So I sort of looked at, well, how could we have a slightly different structure or system for doing things that would enable people to collaborate better? Because, when I looked at the concept of collaboration, it's obviously fantastic for big wicked problems, but it also has a heap of costs too. And so at times we just want to get the right people in the room and then let them sort of punch on and get the work done. So that's where I started. And so I guess my approach was more around structures, and I suppose it's nice that this report has some similar problem identification to mine. So some smarter people have nodded their head and agreed, which is nice, but it's probably become more nuanced in terms of, a softer process that allows autonomy of organisations to be retained, which I think is important for the individual levies, but then also and it creates a framework maybe to build trust and then improve over time. So, yeah.
Ian, maybe you can, because I know you've got quite an interesting take on this, maybe you can jump on Phil's comment around collaboration being costly and what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think collaboration can be costly. You can waste a huge amount of time in collaboration if collaboration isn't done with the right intent or done properly. Interestingly, I think the people that we have sitting in the senior chairs in the industry at the moment are probably the least collaborative people in the sector, which is, maybe being a little bit provocative, but the reality is, I'm one of those people. I was brought up in the 1980s. We passed exams by our own actions and what we did ourselves in terms of sitting in an exam and doing our own study. I look at where my 17-year-old daughter is doing year 13 at the moment. Her most significant module she's got in front of her this year is one where she's working with 4 other people, and she relies entirely on all 4 of them working together as a team to get a grade for that unit. We are training and equipping our young people to be collaborative, and we've been doing that now for probably a number of decades. But the reality is that they are so much better prepared to be collaborators when they come into the business environment, because they've learned how to take risks together and take risks on things that are really important to them. I look at where traditional collaboration is in the sector, and I've written about this on a number of occasions. You take one of the least risky bits of your business, you do it with somebody else to save a bit of cost, and you have a beer at the end of December to celebrate the work you've done together. That's not real collaboration. What we do need is deep collaboration around the risky things that really matter. And I think, we've made some real steps forward. I can look over the 15 years we've been writing the agenda. Organisations like Te Hono have really helped build the trust between people. But it hasn't yet become really substantive collaboration.
Maybe one more question for the 3 of you, if you can all answer this before I try to unface lock this phone to get to the audience questions. But what do you see as the risk to our food and fibre sector if we don't change what we're doing when it comes to industry good? Maybe if we go down the line and start with you, Brendan.
I guess the obvious answer is sort of suboptimal performance, but I guess the scarier part is actually not really addressing some of the existential challenges for the sector and for New Zealand. We've got some real problems in New Zealand in terms of our ability to generate wealth from things other than just using our land and resources here, and I think we need a truly collaborative approach to achieve that. So, it's something much worse than suboptimal performance. Yeah.
I just don't think we've got the scale or the human capital resource to be inefficient, and so I think if we identify that there's fragmentation or silos, which I think has been talked about a fair bit, I think we have to have the endeavour to try and overcome those, and whether we get that right or not, I'm not sure. We won't get it right first time, but I think we have to be attempting to do it. I mean, if we look at like the macro challenges that Ian talks about in agendas and other areas, are our individual sectors, whether they be sheep, beef, honey, onions, potatoes, and then the list that goes on up to sort of 90 or 100 organisations, are they well equipped to be able to deal with AI as an example? Are they able to not just deal with it, but are they able to seize that opportunity to enable growth for the wide range of sectors? I guess if we sort of look at how land management's going, I think yesterday in one of the sessions, people are increasingly not talking about being farmers but being land managers, and so we're increasingly agnostic around our land use type. Sure, I'm a proud sheep and beef farmer, but I'm also sort of linked to catchment communities and derive identity from that, but then also from landscapes. And so I guess it's how does that sort of pan out? I think if we don't do something, we can talk about sort of creating another entity, create some confusion, but personally I think we need it to be able to seize some of the opportunities and some of the challenges we've got ahead.
So if you think about it, our food system is smaller than Nestle, it's smaller than Danone, it's smaller than Unilever, smaller than many of the big American companies. And the reality is, within those organisations, they have all the levers they can pull because they collaborate across organisations and they have processes for collaborating. We don't have those levers available to us at the moment to be able to pull, to be able to retain our position at the top table. The work we've done in the last year indicates New Zealand is welcome at the top table for innovative new food systems, but we're not necessarily taking that seat. I think if we don't collaborate and we don't think about how we have the ability to pull the levers to make the changes needed, our welcome at that table will become less and less obvious over time. And if we're not at that table, for us, the future doesn't look great. So I think this is so critical to enable us to step forward.
So I think, Phil and Ian, you might have kind of touched on our top voted question already, but Matt Lamb asks, does Common Ground create an extra layer of complexity to an already busy system? What would you say to that, Ian?
I don't think it does. I think what it puts in place is a layer of, you could say process, but a layer of thinking, but ultimately enables issues to be dealt with in a way that means we deal with an issue once rather than 40 times. And if we can address that, then the government has a partner they can work with. The solutions work for everybody, and they give us the best solution to a challenge rather than the solution that suits a single particular stakeholder. So I think ultimately we do away with complexity by working together on some of these issues.
I agree. I think the He Waka Eke Noa example, if you completely strip out the issue that it was looking to deal with, I think it attempted to sort of replicate some form of peak body organisation where we were looking as sectors to collaborate on an issue. And so I guess my question is, that is creating another entity. Was the creation of the entity its challenge, or was there something else? And I guess, peak bodies are used in a number of different examples for how individual interest groups agree that they can achieve more together, and then actually follow that agreement with some investment that allows the entity that started to actually get on and do it and not be overburdened with sort of meddling from a sort of the people not being part of a sort of something a bit independent.
I think one other point I didn't raise, maybe if I just flick back a couple of slides quickly, the other part of Common Ground is it to us feels like a logical home for a national food strategy, and being able to give that broader perspective of how food fits within to our wider community. And I know Mavis was just talking about Mana Kai as somebody that was very involved in the preparation and production of the Mana Kai initiative work. We need a home for that work. We need a home for that vision. And I think we've seen the challenge of not having a home with what's happened to Fit for a Better World over the last 6 months with the change in government. So I think, if we can create a body to guide the future alignment of strategy across the sector as well, that's super valuable for us. I'll just bring the QR code up for anybody that hasn't yet clicked it.
I might have failed my test in terms of listening, so let me just check. But we're talking about the platform, the Common Ground platform is a process of facilitation to stand up communities of action, as you call them, on a particular topic. So we're not really talking about setting up new entities. We're talking about facilitating, pieces of collaboration on core portions of work, which exist for as long as they need to exist.
And then they cease to exist.
And so it's not setting up new bodies for the sake of doing it. It's just facilitating that coming together on topics that we agree or that get facilitated to being and identified as needing to be progressed.
And I think sometimes the most powerful organisations you see around the world is those organisations that are set up with a defined life.
Yes.
And you reach the end of that life and everybody's comfortable it's been achieved, you move on.
Yeah, using fractional resources to sort of pull it together, get it done and dissipate. Yep.
So there's a couple of questions around trust, which I think would be interesting to answer. So it's always been an interesting relationship between trust and time, and the breakdown of trust seems to occur when the challenges that face us with more urgency. This is Emma Crutchley's question, by the way. How do we get around this? How do we get around this challenge of urgency but still building that trust?
I think inherently trust does take time, but trust comes from actions as well. So if people act in a way that is designed to build trust, you can accelerate the process of building trust. But as I mentioned earlier, I go back to when we wrote the first agenda. We were talking to people and bringing people together in groups, and it would be very unusual that when we brought people from across sectoral groups that anybody would know anybody else. I look at when we bring those groups together today, there is so much more cross-sector relationship, cross-sector understanding, and by definition, therefore, some degree of trust has already been established. So I think we're already in a much better place today than we were 10 years ago to do this, because I think there is a foundation of trust. We need to scale it, and actions will scale it faster.
I agree. It's about doing some work. So I think if you're doing work, then that's how you build trust. In any other leadership environment, people practice things a lot before they need to then execute it at a high or difficult level. And so I guess if we're working together and working on maybe those simpler things initially, then hopefully that would build that trust through practice and through action and through doing, and then ultimately through some success, right? So
Results.
if you achieve, you feel good, and then you get confidence, and then you do more. So yeah.
Just to prove, I did read the report, I did get to the later pages, which had sort of maybe identified some of the topics which might be safer, but people would recognise that need some shared work, whether that's in biosecurity, some sort of shared work in terms of trying to explore what role AI is going to play. There's already significant industry action and activity looking at data exchange and greater levels of data interoperability. And so I think there's areas that are already being identified, that where some of that, we could spend some of that time, build that trust, that then when there are larger issues or other issues that need addressing, that trust will have already been built up through the process.
Yeah.
I think we've got time for one more question, so we're going to squeeze it in. So Nelson Harper asks, ironically, the work in creating models and initiatives to break down silos is being done repeatedly in silos, with similar frameworks already existing. How do you ensure that these initiatives are not biased towards government, industry, academia, or commercial consultants? What are the actionable steps to put this common ground framework into action?
So I think in terms of how we've thought about the framework, the first and most important step, and we haven't described it as a board, we've described it as a governance group or a governance body, is how you actually select or invite people to join that group. And that, to me, is a really critical process, because you need people with enough knowledge and insight to be able to make decisions, but you also need people that are comfortable leaving their everyday life, their existing commercial relationships and things outside the door when they step into that room. But I think you may not get that exactly right the first time, but I think you will get a much better outcome in terms of doing that than having a sort of process where we have a big voting process or something like that. But getting that group established with a mix of skills that extends well beyond the bounds of our current industry, brings in perspectives from our markets, because we've highlighted the importance of the market view being incorporated, I think is really important to then being able to start. There's then stock takes and things as to what's already been done, but I think actually you only start to do those when you recognise where the issues are you want to step into to begin with.
Today I can actually see the screen with the timer and it's flashing red at me. So I just want to extend my gratitude to both Brendan and Phil for jumping up on the stage and doing the pre-read. It's only, 30, 40 pages, but still, that's still, thank you for your support to us, and thanks also to you, Phil, for the collaborative process that we've gone on with you and AgMart and the AgMart board as well. So.
And can I just quickly add my thanks to Brig, because she actually does all the work. I come out and talk about it, but Brig has done the interviews. She's done a lot of the thinking behind this. She's done a fantastic job in starting a conversation that's so important.